neutral plus.
There you go. Yeah, I am open to new ideas on terms here. I like it. I think it's unsettled as of yet. Yeah, so maybe without further ado, I want to let Greg tell us who the heck are you, Greg? Where did you come from? And now you've got this framework, this thing that we're going to talk about. So maybe you could just give us an overview of what have you been up to in life to this point, and how did you end up interested in the carbon removal space?
Well, shit, I'm a lot older than I look, so this could take a while if you want to go all the way through life.
Part of your professional career, leave the early years out. Maybe that's for the early years later.
My formative years growing up above a hardware store in the Midwest. Okay, fine, I'll leave that out. So yeah, quick summary is literally I've been in the technology industry for 20 years. And that really is starting off with a technical background. I have a BS and CS, as we always called it. So, I was smart enough to reach that level, and then I got smarter in some respects, or dumber, depending on how you look at it, and I moved into sales. So I always have a technical bent to things, and have spent 20 plus years building, complex distributed systems. Initially from working with customers as a technical expert, and then moving into sales, doing some time in product management, most recently working on alliances. So whenever you're dealing with the technology industry, it's always about understanding the lay of the landscape, who you can partner with, who you are competing with. Sometimes they're the same company. And that complexity is the ecosystem. And there's what like I talked about in the video, what I got used to was having consultants, different companies like Gartner that define these different markets, or define these different sectors. Well, we're so early in this that nobody has had a chance to do that, except from the perspective of like the science behind it. So, I'm working on something that is land mass, sequestering in the land, or sequestering by trees, or working on direct air capture, or I'm trying to pull, waste out of the waste stream from a refinery. It's all about the science behind each of those, and not about an overall industry. So when I started looking at climate change more seriously back in early 2018.
Let me ask you, just before you get into what happened when you looked into it, what inspired you to say, I'm gonna take a deep dive into this thing?
So I definitely agreed and understood the high level science. I think it probably came down to a fact of, I was at the time looking at doing some solar panels, and it was like, well, why are we doing this? It's more expensive in some respects. And it came down to a discussion of, well, sometimes you're spending money because of something bigger that you're believing in, right? And so that was sort of where I think kind of started. And then quickly, kind of a side on that is, I also manage my own investment portfolio, and I was one of the early investors shortly after Tesla went public. And so from an investing perspective, I look at things over a longer period. I don't just look at short term, or else I would have sold my stock in Tesla a long time ago with all the ups and downs.
Yeah,
so you have to
over.
Have a long-term vision and have a long-term belief in, this is what we're shooting for. There's going to be ups and downs along the way to that. Are we trending in the right direction or not? And do I believe in the leadership of a company? So just all that research from a Tesla perspective, and then an eventual Solar City perspective, which I was also an investor in, kind of drove a lot of this. And then just coincidentally, a friend of mine who lives nearby here in the Bay Area, his background is in chemistry. And he's been working in this space, in what I now call the, capture at source space, for 15 plus years. And so there was a number of nights just sitting around the fire pit in the backyard, drinking beers, talking about whatever, where this conversation came up, and then it just kind of spun. And I looked at direct air capture as just kind of a different part of what he was doing. And then I started thinking about direct air capture from how is it being done today? And his understanding wasn't quite as deep, but he gave some examples, and I'm like, instinctively for me, that's the wrong way of approaching it. Trying to build a huge industrial size complex like a refinery should be approached from a different perspective of distributed, smaller, distributed, being able to scale quickly. And in some respects, there's a lot of infrastructure out there that can be leveraged for this. So how can we piggyback off of existing infrastructure and instead of trying to build something net new? So that was kind of a discussion around the fire pit 2 years ago. Then I changed jobs, got super busy with the new job. Everything was put on hold. Then with the COVID lockdown, things kind of lightened up a little bit. And I used that opportunity as I was talking to all of my sales reps, and they were all like, oh yeah, I started binge watching this episode or this show on Netflix, and I'm binge watching this thing. And I'm like, what the hell are you guys doing? Why are you wasting this opportunity by just binge watching television? So I kind of started challenging them, and then I thought about, well, what am I challenging myself to do? And so I picked back up this idea that I had, and that's when I stumbled across the air miners community and realized, wow, there's a lot more that I don't know about. And so it became, instead of focusing on my idea, it became like 4 months of somewhat focusing on my idea, but then learning a lot more. And as I learned more and as I talked with more people, it became very evident that everybody was struggling for a way to describe what they do in the bigger picture. And as I started talking to people who are investing in this space, I started to get an understanding that they're willing to understand what's the ROI if I make an investment here versus an investment there. And I think this really kind of came to the forefront with, what's his name, who did the challenge on Twitter for a framework. And I always slaughter his name, isn't it? Chamath?
I think Chamath, yeah.
Pronounce his name?
Yeah. Something. That's my best.
Yeah, I just go, the guy who owns the Warriors, the Facebook guy who owns the Warriors. That's what I always refer to him as. So, I talked to a few people who threw their ideas together, one of which was Jack Sullivan, and he, submitted it to the kind of challenge, which I thought was just kind of a BS bullshit thing that Chamath was doing, essentially trying to steal everybody else's ideas and then go, oh yeah, by the way, I'm also hiring McKinsey, and I'm going to take your ideas and combine all that together. It's like, okay, great. So you're going to make all the money off of this, and all the people who had the ideas are going to be left out. That was kind of my jaded view of what he was trying to do. But as I looked at some of the frameworks that were being talked about, I'm like, this isn't really a framework. This is really you positioning your idea down a path. A framework has to talk about all the different variables that go into it. And that's where my mind went into overdrive on, well, I do this all the time from an alliances perspective and from a sales perspective. So I just started down this path, did a couple of iterations. Jason saw an early version, Jack saw an early version. Tito was also involved in that thread. And what came out of it is what I finally got around to recording here on this last week, and releasing. So if you want, I can view and walk through the thinking of it.
I think that would be helpful. Maybe before we do that, but yeah, I think I'd love to have you kind of walk us through. I mean, even just like the, what are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 boxes. If you're counting the energy transition market as well.
Yeah, I would just pull up.
What are you? I mean, so you said you were looking into this, maybe from the point of view of, someone who manages their own portfolio, investment portfolio. Is that sort of, I guess, what you were hoping to get out of it from a personal perspective? And then what do you think?
Yeah. So
we're going to get out of this?
From a personal perspective, why did I invest the additional time into doing this? As I started looking at the idea that I have and where I'm at, which is sort of early stage research still. And my idea is about taking existing DAC technology or different DAC technologies and building a business around that that is actively removing the carbon, by finding the customers who have the infrastructure that the DAC can be applied as a piggyback on. And there's another angle to it, which is I also see, because the numbers I've done allow this to scale to literally, let's just say multiple gigatons a year at scale. There's another aspect to this of you're essentially become the feedstock to the carbon industry. And there's other people that I've talked to who are like, yeah, we just need more DAC because literally I have a way I can use the carbon and I need more carbon to use. So there's kind of a two-angle approach to this. But the real reason I've kind of said, okay, well, I'll take some of my time and do this, is this becomes the groundwork for anybody I would talk to with regards to my idea and how I would present it. Like, if you understand this, then I can save myself a lot of time when I present my idea, and I can say, I'm focused here and I'm going to be partnering over here, and this is how this whole thing works. And
fit in, these are the people that, this is the part of the industry that I would sell to, and here's our supporting, you know.
Right. Yep. In the end, nothing happens until somebody sells something. You have to sell your idea to an investor. You have to then sell your product to your customer, and then you have to keep selling. So, you know, everybody hates the word salesperson or doesn't like to think of themselves as a salesperson, yet everybody is a salesperson. Every time you're interviewing for a job, you're selling yourself. People forget that.
That was the key reasons for Business Model Lab is we have to figure out how to make money in this world if we're going to scale.
Right, exactly. So I kind of view this as, this isn't the climate change industry. The problem we're trying to solve is we're trying to reverse climate change. What caused climate change is us polluting into our atmosphere and using it as a dumping ground. So in simplistic terms, in my view, the climate change industry is about cleaning that up. And literally, across the street here and across the street over there on my cul-de-sac live two executives at Chevron. Those guys have no fucking clue what they're doing. They want to keep their little world and they want to protect themselves and keep moving forward. And now Chevron is all happy because they just exceeded ExxonMobil's market cap, because ExxonMobil had a bigger loss last quarter than they did. And Chevron laid off more people earlier than ExxonMobil. And it's kind of like, guys, you're not even focusing on the right thing anymore because you're so ingrained in your industry and just trying to keep it alive. So that was kind of the whole genesis of this. And I'm like, I don't necessarily see myself carrying this forward, but I can see others potentially adopting this and using this to describe where they fit in the industry. And if the industry as a whole adopts something similar to this, it's a different way of talking about what we're all doing instead of talking about it from a science perspective, which tends to not confuse people, but it tends to turn off investors when you start going too deep into the science. But if you're talking about it from a business model perspective and how everything starts to work together, that's the kind of view of things. So
yeah, I think you're right.
Does that help?
You can lose people very quickly in the science, and at the same time, you have to give them a grounding in the basics of it. So there's a fine line to tread when, speaking to certain people who don't have that grounding already. And I feel like I always appreciate a quick reorientation or overview. I've heard it 1,000 times, but when you went through it in your presentation, just kind of going through, okay, here's the problem, here's the carbon in the air, here's how much goes into natural sinks and what's left. It's always good to start any conversation with that quick reorientation. One more just thought, can I come to your next neighborhood block party? Because I think there's going to be some interesting conversations with your neighbors.
You just missed the best one. We had a Halloween party. So we shut down the cul-de-sac and all the kids were outside. We had little tables set up and a movie screen, and I was listening to my one neighbor who works at Chevron, her father has been consulting into the industry, and I sat there listening to him talk, and he's very opinionated at his age, and I just sat there like, wow, yeah, you're so locked into your thinking from 30 years ago that you can't see past it. And talking about electrification of the transportation industry, his whole thing was, well, it's so much more efficient. The energy capacity of carbon fuels is so much better than the energy capacity of a battery. And it's like, yeah, but you're not thinking beyond just that little bubble. You're not thinking about the bigger context of what happens to that carbon fuel when you burn it and what impact it's having. And, anyway, so that's, I just sat there biting my tongue, but going, okay, I understand your thinking.
I sent you an email with a 15-minute video to watch. Okay. Yeah. If you do, you have the ability to share your screen and kind of give us like a 5-minute version of things?
I need you to give me share permission.
Give me one moment here. All right. Let's see if that works now.
There we go. Okay. Let me know if everybody can see my screen. And now I'm presenting here, and you guys are located here with my camera. So, so I'm not going to go through this whole deck. This is essentially the deck that I walked through in the video. But in the end, what it comes down to is defining these kind of 3 walls, as I called it. So when we talk about saving, climate change and reversing climate change as an objective, it becomes an objective of the energy market, because looking at where all the sources are coming from, we need to stop those sources and switch to something new. And so when you look at where investments have been happening and where a lot of ROI has been generated financially, it's in that energy transition market, right? It's Solar City, it's Tesla, it's all the windmill manufacturers. I mean, I found a company that is actually a public company that's just a holding company to make investments in clean energy, or not so much clean energy, but climate change solutions. They actually say that on their website. And when I looked at all the climate change solutions, everything that they do is energy transition sector. So energy transition is about moving off of fossil fuels to something else, whatever that is. And that sector is huge already, and it can be subdivided into transportation, can be subdivided into the underlying technologies that enable it, like batteries, et cetera, and utilities and grid scale batteries, and green energy, and all the technology used to balance out the grid when you start to shift from fossil fuels to other sources. So all of that to me is energy transition. It's addressing the source of all this stuff, but it's different than a carbon industry. Because a carbon industry to me is, how do we clean up, mine the air, as the community is named, right? And clean up the CO2 that's been put in there. Then what do we do with it to sequester it, right? Because we're trying to get rid of it. So the sources, like my friend who works developing technologies that go into the waste stream of a refinery, that's capturing it at the source. And then you have negative emissions, which is direct air capture, for lack of a better term. But I didn't want to use direct air capture because I wanted to leave it some flexibility should things change and something else comes out. But there's a huge difference. And when I looked at these, that's where the amounts that you have the potential to impact come into play. And if I'm looking at it from an investment perspective, yeah, great. I can invest in a company that's doing capture at source, but why do people invest in that? The fossil fuel industry today is still only investing in those technologies as a way to greenwash themselves. Until there is a harder cost to them, they're not going to invest in that stuff. And the companies that are in this space are struggling to survive. The company that my buddy works at just had layoffs because the contracts have slowed down because of COVID. Why have the contracts slowed down because of COVID? Because the price of gas has come down so high. Price of oil. Why has the price of oil gone down so quickly? Because we stopped using so much of it. Airline fuel is down 80% because we're not flying. So all of these trickle effects of COVID that are impacting all these different things. But in the end, you have a 40 gigaton per year source of carbon emissions in this sector. And that's going to naturally go down as energy transition accelerates. So if I'm looking at a long-term investment area, I don't see that as being that long of a term investment area. Still important, still has ability for payback if you find the right diamond in the rough there. But if I'm looking at impacting things at a bigger perspective, that has a smaller payback than saying negative emissions, where you're literally cleaning up everything that's been put into the atmosphere. And that's what's causing all of the climate change problems right now. It's being amplified by the sources that are continuing to emit. And the careful thing that we have to deal with here is not talk about negative emissions as a solution to continuing to pollute at the source, because both have to be applied. But I think negative emissions has the ability of scaling up to solve the problem. And I don't like to be one, as sort of a nature person in general, I don't like to focus on technology solutions to solve these problems if nature can do it. But I think we're past the point of nature doing it, because nature's been doing it all this time. And so there's a whole another aspect to this, which I'll get into a little bit. But it's sucking up on this side, and then it's sequestering it on the other side, plain and simple, right? But you've got the natural sinks, which the artificial removing of the carbon, we can't directly inject it into natural sinks as much. Because as I thought about, if I'm capturing a whole bunch of carbon, where am I going to deposit it? Well, where do people deposit it today? Well, it ends up becoming injecting it into the ground just to squeeze more oil out and hope that most of it stays in the ground after you inject it. So you're not really solving the problem, because you're just continuing to create the problem along the way. So that's where the product and the engineered sinks in my mind really come into play. And I just had natural sinks and product sinks, and I realized that, well, there's all this effort to take technology plus nature and try to accelerate it. What would we call that? And so that's where I came up with the engineered sink terminology. Mm-hmm. But in the end, I think the product sink area has the potential longer term to grow much bigger, because you're actually creating more value. You're taking the CO2 and you're using it to build something which is creating more value. So over the longer term, the product sink area will become a much bigger market. And that's when I get into, there's a kind of a hidden area here between the two, which is those arrows. You're going to have a lot of carbon being captured. How do you get it from the source of capture over to the product sinks? And that's sort of the risk involved with my business idea, which is, if I am distributing a bunch of direct air capture units all over the place, they're collecting carbon. What do I do with that carbon? How do I collect it? So there's a whole logistics aspect that can be easily overlooked, but is massive, which lives right here on these arrows. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, Greg, would you kind of restate that problem area in those gray arrows? It was something along the lines of, you're collecting this carbon, what do you do with it? Would you just say it in your own words?
So we're collecting carbon either at a source or using direct air capture. If you look at why direct air capture to date has been a large industrial deployment model, it's because they have to do something with that carbon once they capture it. And if you look at, some of the larger sources, they're either trying to convert it into a fuel, so they need to have kind of refinery capabilities nearby, and then a source to send that fuel to, which I don't know if their models are taking into consideration all the environmental costs of that, or they're just taking and injecting it back into the ground. And so you build your big facility close to where you're doing that. Well, in a distributed model, I'm collecting CO2 from all over the place, and then I'm trucking it, for lack of a better term, or moving it to a centralized location, and then I'm doing something with it. So that's the logistics, CO2 logistics, that kind of falls in place here. Because as I was thinking about my negative emissions solution, where am I going to sequester that? Because I'm not doing anything with sequestering. I'm going to partner there. I'm not directly today doing anything net new with kind of absorption technology. I'm taking absorption technology and I'm applying it to a business model, which is direct air capture and has the ability to scale. So I leave myself the flexibility in my model to be able to switch out my absorption technology. And then I capture everything. And then where do I put it after I capture it? Well, and naturally I could essentially move it to the CO2 pipeline, which exists in the country, but then it's just going back into the ground to squeeze out more oil. I want to be able to figure out something else to do with it from the product side and essentially become a carbon provider to the product industry. And there are a number of people that are working in that area that as they look at how their solutions scale, they're like, I need access to more carbon. We need more advancement in direct air capture because I need access to more carbon. So you've got a supply on the left and you've got a demand on the right model to your industry.
Bring the supply to where it can meet the demand, or at least aggregate distributed mining to a centralized location where products can be at scale produced with that mined product.
Right.
I mean, it seems analogous to me. Strange fact about my past, I worked building natural gas pipelines for a year out here in Colorado, and it just seems somewhat analogous to that. I don't know. I mean, if you've gotten to this point, how do you actually see that carbon moving? Is it via pipeline? Is it some other means?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I go back to looking at why. Why do we have a CO2 pipeline today? It's literally a byproduct of the fossil fuel industry. It's to capture CO2 at different sources, truck it to geological formations where it can be injected to squeeze more oil out. Short term, that can be leveraged from our industry. But anybody who's doing that needs to acknowledge that, and that needs to be taken into consideration from an ESG ROI perspective, right? What is the real amount of carbon that they're capturing if what they used gets injected to force more carbon up into our cycle, right? Mm-hmm. So the other option becomes, there are people who are talking about how can we leverage that carbon to make products? Well, you're now talking about essentially a factory. What do you do with that carbon? If you're talking about a small amount of carbon, like if you're in your book printing example, if you need to have the ink and you want to have that ink be pulled out of the air and coming from carbon, well, you could literally, in some theories, create a small DAC solution that just produces ink, right? Perfect example. During COVID, everything got locked down, right? What was one of the side effects that very few people probably heard about? Was the brewing industry. Small microbreweries could not get CO2 from their suppliers because the suppliers didn't want to risk their people trucking things to small locations when they could make more money and have less cost by just supplying the CO2 to the largest breweries. So there was a company that I heard about, and I don't remember the name offhand, but they created a direct air capture unit that for $100,000 a microbrewery or a small brewery could buy, that would catch the CO2, collect the CO2 from the air, and then let them use that to inject that back into their beer for carbonization. So, there's all these little ramifications that when something big happens, you get all these shifts in the industry. So if you're already transporting CO2 around for these products, you could augment that very easily by having the source of it being picked up from sources where it's being mined out of the air.
Yeah. That if I could just interject for a second, that's interesting because again, during COVID, again, another perturbation of the system is that people are buying alcohol, in greater quantities now because they're home and they need a respite from the lockdown. So demand is there. Demand is higher than it's ever been for beer and spirits. Interestingly, ethanol ethanol to
Not
go
to
into
mention
gas.
medication purposes.
That too, right? Self-medication, but also ethanol to go into gas. Not as much demand for that. So there's a glut of that at, say, it's not the most perfect climate solution in the world, to be sure, but with biofuel ethanol producers in, say, the Midwest, Iowa, Nebraska, what have you. So they don't have. There's not as much gas to demand for gasoline today as there had been 12 months ago. But distilleries still need. Are still demanding this stuff. So it's a very interesting quirk of the of where we're at in terms of our economy right now.
Yeah. So but let's just take that from a bigger picture perspective. If I'm on the left-hand side here and I'm, collecting CO2, and then if I'm providing that to a product company, I'm providing it to a brewery, I'm not really removing the CO2 from the CO2 life cycle, right? Because it's not being locked away. It's just being shifted. So there's some questions about that, which I think need to be taken into consideration when you're doing an ROI, you're doing your ESG ROI. But yeah, I mean, in the end, I think there's a lot more product innovations that will happen. And so we're so early here, I'm looking out like 15, 20 years. Hopefully I'm looking out only 10 years. But if things start to get jump started, then there's going to be a need for the supply of this natural resource, right? And it's capturing it over here on the left-hand side and then being a supplier on the right-hand side. Well, you don't think about it when you think about Amazon. You just say Amazon. And depending on where you live in the world, from a business perspective, you're going to think of them either as, oh, I buy all my stuff from them, or you might think of them as, oh, that's the cloud computing, right? AWS. But what you forget about is this piece in the middle. Well, if you're selling stuff, they have to get that to you. And more often now you're seeing Amazon trucks. And so Amazon has a whole logistics arm, which you look back through all of the investor letters into the very first one that Bezos had, he identified that as a problem. And he kind of, whether he thought that he was going to be building his own logistics FedEx type system, he realized that, hey, at the scale I need to operate, I can be my own FedEx, and I'm going to save myself money. So I see this as a big issue. I don't see this part here in the middle, these arrows, as an unsolvable issue. I think it's already been solved multiple times over. FedEx did it, UPS did it. Before them, the US Postal Service did it. Amazon's doing it now. There's companies that do it from other perspectives for chemicals, and all we're talking about is CO2 in this perspective. Now, there's ways that some people are looking at vertically integrating the left side and the right side and putting those all together into one facility. But if we're trying to scale quickly to address the left-hand side, then you're going to need this piece in the middle, which is a logistics arm.
And I think the biggest companies, the winners in 5-10 years that emerge will scale, and they'll gobble up those middle gray arrows and incorporate them into their processes and vertically integrate all aspects. But I think where we are today, there's a ton of opportunity in that little space. Yeah.
And those exact companies are going to be the ones in 10 years, maybe a little bit longer, depending on politics. But those companies are going to be the ones that are going to be bigger than the fossil fuel companies at that point. I mean, who remembers back, how long ago was it? Only 10 years ago that ExxonMobil was the largest company in the world? Maybe it was 15 now. I think they're out of market cap perspective.
Top 10 now? I think they're out of the top 5. I don't know.
They're out of like the top 40, I think.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, Chevron just last week became bigger than ExxonMobil from a market cap perspective. So, but anyway, but this is the active part. This is where the taking out of the carbon and locking that carbon away happens. But that then goes back to, okay, that's the middle part of the sandwich. You need the bread, right? So, or as I said here, the foundation and the roof. What gets this wheel spinning? Unfortunately, today, what's getting this wheel spinning are these financial and regulatory models. So once we, as governments around the world agree to put a price on carbon and start charging people for using our atmosphere as a dumping zone, then those of us who are going to be cleaning it up have an ability to collect that money as well, right? So that's where the financial and the regulatory models come into play. The financial models have kind of been jump-started without a lot of governments by larger companies saying, yes, I think this is a problem and I'm going to invest in it, even though it's more for marketing purposes right now, from a value add to my business, right? This is why Amazon, why Microsoft, why Apple, Facebook, all these other large companies are saying these things about being carbon neutral. But like we then talked about earlier, what is the audit side of this? You've got, if you're a company here in the middle who's claiming you can pull X amount of carbon out, or you can sequester Y amount of carbon, and there is a financial model which pays you for that, how do you prove that you're doing that? No one's going to take you at your face value, so that's where the certification comes in. So that's why this governance part on top is who's doing the auditing, who's doing the certification. Mm-hmm. To a certain extent, that's the marketplaces as well, right? Nori, by having a marketplace, has to be able to do the certification on both sides to a degree. And then there's enablement technologies that are measuring these things and automating that whole audit and certification constantly and in real time, that I also kind of lump into that space altogether. But in some ways, this enablement part here might be important enough that this piece here maybe needs to be really thought of as governance and enablement, as a category name or a sector name. I don't know. That was the one thing that kind of hit me in real time while I was recording my my video. So that's then the bigger picture.
An example of a company working in this space, as you just mentioned, is Nori, and they're, as you also mentioned, they're sort of playing both sides of the fence, sort of.
Right. So when I talk about defining a map,
or do you see that needing to sort of be decoupled, where you've got, enablement, governance, auditing on one side, and then separate entities on the other side of the market?
I think you will end up with, if this is a sector, I think you'll have areas inside the sector. And so I think you will end up seeing an audit area. You may see a consulting area, because you've got all the, if you have to do this, what's the environmental review acronym now?
EPA.
What?
Is it EPA you're thinking?
No, the TIA. TIA.
Oh yeah, yes. Life cycle analysis, TEA. Techno-economic analysis. Yes.
Yes, thank you. There are going to be companies that are going to be coming up just to do that. There already are, to a certain extent, whether they're considered companies. I know a lot of the guys was at University of Michigan that were doing that, right? Yeah. Who did that one presentation. So I mean, that's kind of an area where they may lay the landscape of how you do it, and they may be the educational arm. But then you're going to have a whole bunch of people who will just start to spin up as consultants, where that's my job, is I just do that. So that will be like an area inside the governance sector. Yeah. To kind of show as an example, I just did a cursory review here. And so like life cycle analysis, verification, monitoring analysis, modeling, reporting, I just kind of threw these out there. But then Puro Earth and Nori would be two examples of companies that are in this. And I put my little stamp here that this is just based on a cursory analysis I did last night to have some examples for everybody. Look at the capture at source industry. Here's a couple of companies that, would play in that particular industry, right? Negative emissions. Here's a whole bunch of different companies that you could claim are negative emissions. Now, this becomes a little bit of a special case, right? Because, and Verdox, to a degree, I don't know what their business model yet is. I don't know if they're going to just create the technology and then license it or sell it to others, or if they're going to try to do a full solution, kind of like carbon engineering. Because I see there being a need for the absorbent technology to be hyper-focused for efficiency, and then to be able to be licensed out to a lot of different companies who can then apply that to be able to truly hit the scale that we need as quickly as possible. Going down then to natural sink sequestration. Here's a couple more examples, right? Looking at it from a soil sequestration, forestation, weathering and mineralization. And again, I just created these. I have no idea that these are the right terms for the different areas. So this is where my intuition is there is a need here. I'm not going to be the one to go do the deeper analysis to define the areas inside of each sector. And quite honestly, that's where there's consulting companies that do this, and that's how they make their money. I'm not interested in creating a consulting company right now. So, but that's just kind of how I kind of see this evolving. And this could even be, I've seen this done at a volunteer level from like an industry consortium perspective in the technology space, but I've also seen this done from a consulting perspective, and one consultant kind of bubbles to the top and everybody starts to adopt their terminology. Jason, do you have?
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, I agree with you totally that there's a whole industry about verification and effectively carbon accounting that has yet to spring up. I can see new players entering this field again, either from universities, springing from universities to start their own companies. I could even see existing accounting firms. DNVGL in particular is a verifier for Puro. Nori uses this academic certification service from a place called Comet Farm. So, it's a little bit more particularly acute for the natural solution for forestation, soil carbon sequestration, etc. But it's something that the whole industry needs that there's a whole service for the ecosystem of carbon removal.
I would say the need is there across all methodologies. I think it's maybe a little more complicated, at least from a calculus standpoint, if you're looking at the forestry stuff. But
yes,
the need to have that accounting and have it made reliable, whether that's through some sort of blockchain technology or whatever it might be, it's equal through all technologies. And interestingly, I did my master's thesis on carbon.
And that's just it. I mean, there's
moved away from that since it was 2005. Just didn't see as much of a market or need for it. So I've been doing other things for some time, but perhaps it's time to go sharpen those pencils again.
So, I mean, if I play this forward in my head, I've been working with the large SIs, global systems integrators, from my day job perspective. But a lot of those guys have evolved out of the auditing world. So Deloitte, for example, KPMG, EY. So they have this, and then you have like McKinsey, who does more of that business strategy consulting. As I've asked some of those guys, they all know about climate change and they all start having these opinions about climate change. They will start to spin up a little bit as well. But what will eventually happen is whoever evolves in the next year or two as a leader in this space from a consulting perspective, how they survive and how they make money over that year or two is one of the big questions. But their opportunity is to eventually be acquired and rolled into one of these large consultancies. That's kind of the exit strategy I would see there potentially. And then, but this governance aspect on the top is intrinsically tied to the financial and regulatory model. The big companies are not going to focus on it until there is an opportunity for them to make money there. And until there is a regulatory aspect from government that we need to start thinking about carbon, they're not going to focus on it. That's just, their businesses in the end. So until their customers are asking for it, then they'll start focusing on it on the big side up here. So that's kind of that early stage industry dynamics that exist today. So just like from the mining side on the left-hand side here, Christian, you mentioned earlier that your the program that you're involved with is talking about carbon products, right? Wasn't that what you said? So
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
there you go. So it's looking at. It would be interesting to get kind of your professor's viewpoint. Like, why did he focus on that? What was his trigger in his mind that said, oh, did he realize there would be a need and there would be all this excess CO2 that needs to be moved over to here? Or, what caused him to focus in that area, right?
True. And I don't know. My opinion is for the products. I think the goal of getting to have successful carbon capture and utilization is to also have that sequestration piece tied on. And so I think you did a good job defining of like the product sink, where you said long lived. I'm curious though, like when you say long lived, are you talking about like 15 years, 100 years, 1,000 years? Like what's the time scale there for how long that carbon is locked away?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer there. I would definitely say it's got to be longer than 20 years, right? Because you're looking at a life cycle, and part of it comes down to if we're talking about CO2, if we're talking about CO2 moving into the product, like think of injecting CO2 into cement, right? And having it be bound into the cement. Well, when is that CO2 going to be released back into the atmosphere? Depending on the product it's being injected into, it may not be released back into the atmosphere, even when the building made out of that cement collapses. Eventually, the building gets destroyed after 50 years and the cement gets put into a landfill somewhere and buried, right? So if you have a direct air capture system that can also take the CO2 and break it apart and just create the raw carbon, that raw carbon can be used in products, or worst case, if you're just trying to sequester it, bury it into a landfill, right? All you're doing is over the longer term cycle, you're just putting it back where it came from, which was buried in the ground to begin with before it got extracted as oil. So.
Yeah, I'm also curious, like how I know I watched your video and I know that you talked about the economics of climate change, and that's something I focused on a little bit. And you mentioned the Columbia and Harvard like paper. I was wondering like how responsive talking to investors are they to the huge costs that are coming up? Like do they have like a realization that every dollar that they're not putting in carbon removal is potentially, for lack of a better word, a depreciating dollar? Like
Yeah,
what's
I don't
the
think they're
consensus
there yet.
Yeah.
I don't think they're there yet. I think once you mention that to them, you have to walk them through it a little bit. The beginning step is early on when you're having these discussions with investors, it's kind of like, should we be having this discussion or not? AKA, do you believe that climate change is real or not? Because if you don't, then you're focusing on this for the wrong reasons. But if you're actually trying to fix the climate and the long-term existential threat that creates for humanity and the way we're used to having things be, things will always change to a degree and we have to adapt to that. But when things like when you may have how many millions of people who live along the coast may need to relocate because of global warming and flooding, that's a huge cost. Who owns all that land along the coast? What about all the businesses that were built there? There's all of that goes into play there. And once you kind of open up their minds to that, they're like, oh, okay. Because in the end, yeah, and I think that's what Chamath really understood, and why he was asking for more details around the framework, is that I've got all these other investments over here. If I don't invest over here as well to solve this problem, this is all going to go away.
Cool. I have to bolt, so it's been great, gentlemen.
Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Greg, for all this work. Looks fantastic.
Thanks.
Yeah, and it is getting towards the top of the hour. I don't know, Greg, have you got a few minutes to spill over if we wanted?
I do. If there's more questions, sure.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to just keep the dialogue going. John and Adrian, thanks for joining us, by the way. Good to see you guys. Oh, bye, Adrian.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here again. Missed the old business model lab.
Greg, yeah, me too. Thanks for saying that. Greg, what are you hoping people do with this? And how are you wanting to get this out into the world, or are you?
I've been actually that's part of the reason I delayed on publishing this, because I was like, well, what is my purpose here? So I mean, I do think that if there's a value that the community as a whole sees around this, just using this as a way to talk about what we're doing. And like I said, you know, if these are the different natural areas to be able to describe to an investor, I live here and I partner with people here, here, and here, and here, and here's why, right? So once they understand that, then you can move past it quicker and get to the real meat of why should they invest with you, right? But then there's the other aspect of it is, okay, as an investor, I'm looking at this going, all right, I'm thinking long term. My typical time horizons when I buy any investment is at least a 5-year horizon. Here, I'm looking at, shit, am I going to be investing my kids' college funds into this, or am I going to be investing their retirement funds into this so that they have it on the other side in 30 years? Where would I put that dollar now if I'm thinking 30 years long? And so that's another angle to this. And I think that's what Chamath was really looking at when he was asking about this. So this is just kind of sharing this with the world and seeing where it goes. I don't necessarily have an end goal here other than being able to use this for my own when I talk to people.
I think whether you are an entrepreneur, a wantrepreneur, or an investor, I actually think the investor perspective on this maybe is the most useful, as far as maybe what you just said is looking at this and saying, okay, well, you know, what are the industries, what are the markets, what are the specific businesses and business models that maybe are going to come to fruition first, that need to happen soon to enable the next step. And there's this sort of evolution that, like, some are on a 30-year horizon, some are on a 5-year horizon, some are ready and ripe and potentially already happening right now.
Yeah.
But there's a time frame perspective to look at this, and I think that takes maybe the investor hat to look at it that way. And
there is a journey from that perspective. That's the other aspect that I think about from a technology perspective. If you're adopting a technology, you want to think about how that could proliferate across an enterprise over their multiple years of using it. And some companies start with one little product and then they acquire others, and it grows into something that can be a journey. But 10 years later into that company's life cycle, they need to be able to talk about the journey, because all their early adopters used beginning technology, but now they're getting to the mass market and they want to move people into it. They got to talk about how that works. That's the same thing I'm thinking about here.
And I think that there are people who are really good at this. I don't know if I'm one of them, but you know, there are people who call themselves futurists or just are, you know, prescient about where markets will go. I think there's probably ways and frameworks to think about frameworks on how to use a framework. So how do we tell a story of how this evolves from the perspective of, you know, one tiny sliver of the market? Like how does that touch all parts of this framework? It's an interesting maybe exercise or just way to think about this, is how do we get through here, and what potential markets, businesses, and business models come out of that as like, oh, well, then you're going to need this. And then in a few years, you're probably going to need this because it's going to grow and it's going to need these things. There's just an interesting, almost like story, like mini novella you have to write to really think through this and come up with how does this bloom and blossom over time.
Right. So to convert this back to like the business model aspect of the discussion here, that's where I think this becomes important, is to look at what is the financial ROI, which is if I'm going to invest $1, I'm going to get how many dollars out and how long out am I going to get that. But if based on where we're at and kind of the challenge that we're trying to solve and the impact that has across the globe, that's where the ESG ROI has to come into play, right? So right now, we don't have a good price for carbon necessarily, right? Or a real global carbon market. So if I'm doing a DAC project today, why would somebody fund it? And that's the challenge I have with the business that I'm looking at as well, right? I'm at that pre-seed funding stage of like, okay, I need funds to be able to continue to do this research to see if this can be really pulled out or not, someone's not going to invest in that because of a financial ROI, unless they can see 10 years out. But if you can show them that, hey, look, if you can invest $1 million in this now, I think I can produce a pilot, and that pilot has then a roadmap that I can show you where 5 years out, we can be capturing 2 gigatons a year at a 5-year out scale. And, you know, that's a graph. There's always a low boundary. There's also a euphemistic high boundary, right? And you have to kind of show that to an investor of, this is the future that this is the journey I'm painting to you as an entrepreneur, that this is the journey I want you to be with me on. And here's the path of that journey, right?
Do you feel like we can do that today with low bound being, okay, here's the voluntary market that we're dealing with now, and just sort of, you know, this is business as usual. Here's if we get some sort of regulation in place, and those are the sort of high and low bound.
Right. I mean, has anybody stopped to think, and I've been on a couple of calls with some of these people, community calls, where I don't think anyone's ever asked the question, why has AWS made $1 billion fund to invest in this technology? Is it because he sees the financial ROI in the future? Is it because he sees the environmental impact and wants to mitigate it? If he's investing $1 billion right now, the financial ROI is not going to come out for 10 years. Now, Bezos thinks those long terms anyway, so that's not as surprising. But like, why is Apple focusing so much on hyping their carbon neutrality? The financial ROI for them on that $1 million investment, hypothetically, is not true financial. It's marketing. It's the goodwill for their customer base. They may have a long-term vision, but the near-term payout is to be able to say, hey, look, I'm not part of the problem.
Yeah.
Now, as everything starts to shift more quickly, and that will determine probably the speed of that shift will largely be determined here in the US based off of the vote count over the next 24, 48 hours, right?
No big deal.
That could change. And now all of a sudden it becomes more of a financial issue, and they were ahead of the curve, right? So that's that dynamic that I'm struggling with. And, you know, I've had conversations with others where it's the same thing. How do I pitch this to an investor? I don't have a good financial model like a typical VC would want, but a typical VC isn't going to be investing in this stuff anyway. Yeah. You're going to be looking for people who are doing this level of investing here. And so what area has the biggest payout, right?
Yeah.
So that's where my thinking is. I can't claim it's anything more than high level thinking right now.
I don't disagree with anything you're saying. I don't think you're far off. And holistically, yeah, you're looking at the ESG ROI and a financial ROI, but most companies aren't doing that. And, you know, with voluntary carbon commitments, it certainly is about the marketing. It is a way of saying, hey, look, this is why you should do business with us versus those guys. We care, we're doing this. And, you know, I think there's sort of a confluence of factors. There's that, hoping to gain some business through some strategic, you know, environmental marketing. And, you know, it doesn't have to be greenwashing. It can be real.
Right.
There's also, you know, the idea that, okay, look, we do need to sort of start the tidal wave to change things, because disruption to our entire way of life is going to disrupt this business necessarily. So we don't want that. So maybe we can start that change on our own. But I think this wouldn't be the first business model lab call that sort of comes to a close with the conclusion that, like, we really do need the regulatory and a price on carbon from, you know, the powers that be. We need to move beyond voluntary markets at some point, and that is when it's game time, right? It's when
right.
We're all sort of trying to get ourselves ready to run when that happens, but who knows?
Absolutely.
Good. I think this might be a good stopping place, but I want to just pause for a second, see if anyone has any final parting questions for Greg or just thoughts on what we've discussed.
I'm good. Thank you, Greg, for your presentation. I guess I did have one parting thought. When you were talking about like the different numbers, I was wondering if you could just like quickly give in the presentation like some sort of analogy so that people like know what's like $100 trillion. That's a lot of money, but that's like 20 times the US federal budget, or so just some quick little fact that gets people to realize, oh, that's what that means. Like, wow, that's a lot. Because I feel like
Yeah,
when we
that's a
toss
good
around
point.
these big numbers, it just goes over people's heads and their eyes kind of glaze over.
I had the same realization too when I was talking about like, oh, 40 gigatons. Everyone's like, 40? That's not a very big number. It's like, oh wait, you don't know what a gigaton is. Okay, let's put that into something you can relate to. And I've seen somebody, was like, okay, if my goal is to remove this much carbon from the atmosphere, what does that look like? Well, that would be 5 million, gallons of milk, or something along that line, right? So yeah, there is a make it relatable aspect to this, which if we dive too deep into the science, we forget that. And the good analogy there is, imagine you were explaining this to your parents. How would you explain it to them so they could get it? Once you can do that, then you're ready to go talk to investors.
That's true.
So, but that's a good point. I'll see if I can add something to the blog post that I put out there as well about that.
Awesome. Sounds good.
And Greg, 2 final questions. Okay, if people contact you with additional questions and feedback.
Yeah. Reach out with any additional questions. You can hit me up on the Slack channel. I'm going to try to be more attentive to that now. I had some family stuff pop up the last 2 weeks, so I've got that behind me now. But you can also just email me directly. So.
And then finally, the slides, are those potentially available to share through the channel?
Yeah, they're actually posted on the blog post. I did add them yesterday as PDF versions of the slides. So you can just go to that blog post.
Then I will grab a link to that blog post and I'll put them in the Your Miners Business Model Lab channel, and people can access them that way.
Perfect.
And, this is being recorded. We will we'll get this up and shareable for too long so people can access it. It's been a great conversation. Thanks, Greg.
I know how much time the editing takes, so good luck there.
Interns. All right. Take care.
All right.
Greg.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah.